Hi, everybody. So it's Christmas Day at Hogwarts, and there's very few students that stayed for the Christmas holidays. So they are eating Christmas dinner with the professors in the Great Hall, and Professor Trelawney just came in and joined them. She's the one who can supposedly see the future. So that's where we are in the middle of page 228. "Certainly, certainly," said Dumbledore, his eyes twinkling. "Let me draw up a chair. Thank you for joining us, Professor Trelawney." And he did indeed draw a chair in mid-air with his wand, which revolved for a few seconds before falling with a thud between Professor Snape and McGonagall. Professor Trelawney, however, did not sit down. Her enormous eyes had been roving around the table, and she suddenly uttered a kind of soft scream. "I dare not, Headmaster! If I join the table, we shall be 13. Nothing could be more unlucky. Never forget that when 13 dine together, the first to rise will be the first to die." "We'll risk it, Sybil," said Professor McGonagall impatiently. "Do sit down. The turkey's getting stone cold." Professor Trelawney hesitated, then lowered herself into the empty chair, eyes shut and mouth clenched tight, as though expecting a thunderbolt to hit the table. Professor McGonagall poked a large spoon into the nearest tureen. "Tripe, Sybil?" Professor Trelawney ignored her. Eyes open again, she looked around once more and said, "But where is dear Professor Lupin?" "I'm afraid the poor fellow is ill again," said Dumbledore, indicating that everybody should start serving themselves. "Most unfortunate that it should happen on Christmas Day." "But surely you already knew that, Sybil," said Professor McGonagall, her eyebrows raised. Professor Trelawney gave Professor McGonagall a very cold look. "Certainly I knew, Minerva. I know all. I can see the future," she said quietly. "But one does not parade the fact that one is all-knowing. I frequently act as though I am not possessed of the inner eye, so as not to make others nervous." "That explains a great deal," said Professor McGonagall tartly. Professor Trelawney's voice suddenly became a good deal less misty. "If you must know, Minerva, I have seen that poor Professor Lupin will not be with us for very long. He seems aware himself that his time is short. He positively fled when I offered to crystal gaze for him." "Imagine that," said Professor McGonagall dryly. "I doubt," said Dumbledore, in a cheerful but slightly raised voice, which put an end to Professor McGonagall and Professor Trelawney's conversation, "that Professor Lupin is in any immediate danger. Severus, you've made the potion for him again?" "Yes, Headmaster," said Snape. "Good," said Dumbledore. "Then he should be up and about in no time. Derek, have you had any of these chipolatas? They're excellent." The first-year boy went furiously red on being addressed directly by Dumbledore, and took the platter of sausages with trembling hands. Professor Trelawney behaved almost normally until the very end of Christmas dinner 2 hours later. Full to bursting with Christmas dinner, and still wearing their party hats, Harry and Ron got up first from the table, and she shrieked loudly, "My dears! Which of you left his seat first? Which?" "I don't know," said Ron, looking uneasily at Harry. "I doubt it will make much difference," said Professor McGonagall coldly, "unless a mad axeman is waiting outside the doors to slaughter the first into the entrance hall." Even Ron laughed. Professor Trelawney looked highly affronted. "Coming?" Harry said to Hermione. "No," Hermione muttered. "I want a quick word with Professor McGonagall." "Probably trying to see if she can take any more classes," yawned Ron, as they made their way into the entrance hall, which was completely devoid of mad axemen. When they reached the portrait hole, they found Sir Cadogan enjoying a Christmas party with a couple of monks, several previous headmasters of Hogwarts, and his fat pony. He pushed up his visor and toasted them with a flagon of mead. "Merry Christmas! Password?" "Scurvy cur," said Ron. "And the same to you, sir," roared Sir Cadogan, as the painting swung forward to admit them. Harry went straight up to the dormitory, collected the firebolt and the broomstick servicing kit Hermione had given him for his birthday, brought them downstairs, and tried to find something to do to the firebolt. However, there were no bent twigs to clip, and the handle was so shiny already it seemed pointless to polish it. He and Ron simply sat admiring it from every angle until the portrait hole opened, and Hermione came in accompanied by Professor McGonagall. Though Professor McGonagall was head of Gryffindor House, Harry had seen her in the common room only once before, and that had been to make a very grave announcement. He and Ron stared at her, both holding the firebolt. Hermione walked around them, sat down, picked up the nearest book, and hid her face behind it. "So that's it, is it?" said Professor McGonagall beadily, walking over to the fireside and staring at the firebolt. Miss Granger has just informed me that you have been sent a broomstick, Potter. Harry and Ron looked around at Hermione. They could see her forehead reddening over the top of her book, which was upside down. "May I?" said Professor McGonagall, but she didn't wait for an answer before pulling the firebolt out of their hands. She examined it carefully from handle to twig ends. And there was no note at all, Potter? No card? No message of any kind? No, said Harry blankly. I see, said Professor McGonagall. Well, I'm afraid I will have to take this, Potter. What? Said Harry, scrambling to his feet. Why? It will need to be checked for jinxes, said Professor McGonagall. Of course, I'm no expert, but I dare say Madam Hooch and Professor Flitwick will strip it down. Strip it down? Repeated Ron, as though Professor McGonagall was crazy. It shouldn't take more than a few weeks, said Professor McGonagall. You will have it back if we are sure it is jinx-free. There's nothing wrong with it, said Harry, his voice shaking slightly. Honestly, Professor, you can't know that, Potter, said Professor McGonagall quite kindly. Not until you've flown it. At any rate, and I'm afraid that is out of the question until we are certain that it has not been tampered with. I shall keep you informed. Professor McGonagall turned on her heel and carried the firebolt out of the portrait hole which closed behind her. Harry stood staring after her, the tin of high-finished polish still clutched in his hands. Ron, however, rounded on Hermione. What did you go running to McGonagall for? Hermione threw her book aside. She was still pink in the face, but stood up and faced Ron defiantly. Because I thought, and Professor McGonagall agrees with me, that broom was probably sent to Harry by Sirius Black. So that's the end of that chapter. We're now on chapter 12. And it is called the Patronus. Harry knew that Hermione had meant well, but that didn't stop him from being angry with her. He had been the owner of the best broom in the world for a few short hours, and now, because of her interference, he didn't know whether he would ever see it again. He was positive that there was nothing wrong with the firebolt now, but what sort of state would it be in once it had been subjected to all sorts of anti-jinx tests? Ron was furious with Hermione, too. As far as he was concerned, the stripping down of a brand new firebolt was nothing less than criminal damage. Hermione, who remained convinced that she had acted for the best, started avoiding the common room. And Ron supposed she had taken refuge in the library and didn't try to persuade her to come back. All in all, they were glad when the rest of the school returned shortly after New Year, and Gryffindor Tower became crowded and noisy again. Wood sought Harry out on the night before term started. Had a good Christmas? He said, and then, without waiting for an answer, he sat down, lowered his voice, and said, I've been doing some thinking over Christmas, Harry. After last match, you know. If the Dementors come to the next one, we can't afford you to, well... Wood broke off, looking awkward. I'm working on it, said Harry quickly. Professor Lupin said he'd train me to ward off the Dementors. We should be starting this week. He said he'd have time after Christmas. Ah, said Wood, his expression clearing. Well, in that case, I really didn't want to lose you as Seeker, Harry. And have you ordered a new broom yet? No, said Harry. What? You'd better get a move on, you know. You can't ride that shooting star against Ravenclaw. He got a firebolt for Christmas, said Ron. A firebolt? No. Seriously? A real firebolt? Don't get excited, Oliver, said Harry gloomily. I haven't got it anymore. It was confiscated. And he explained all about how the firebolt was now being checked for jinxes. Jinxed? How could it be jinxed? Sirius Black, Harry said warily. He's supposed to be after me, so McGonagall reckons he might have sent it. Waving aside the information that a famous murderer was after his seeker, Wood said, But Black couldn't have bought a firebolt. He's on the run. The whole country's on the lookout for him. How could he just walk into Quality Quidditch Supplies and buy a new broomstick? I know, said Harry, but McGonagall still wants to strip it down. Wood went pale. I'll go and talk to her, Harry, he promised. I'll make her see reason. A firebolt. A real firebolt on our team. She wants Gryffindor to win as much as we do. I'll make her see sense. Ha, a firebolt. Classes started again the next day. The last thing anyone felt like doing was spending 2 hours on the grounds on a raw January morning, but Hagrid had provided a bonfire full of salamanders for their enjoyment, and they spent an unusually good lesson collecting dry wood and leaves to keep the fire blazing, while the flame-loving lizard scampered up and down the crumbling white hot logs. The first divination lesson of the new term was much less fun. Professor Trelawney was now teaching them palmistry, and she lost no time in informing Harry that he had the shortest lifeline she had ever seen. It was defense against the dark arts that Harry was keen to get to. After his conversation with Wood, he wanted to get started on his anti-Dementor lessons as soon as possible. "Ah, yes," said Lupin, when Harry reminded him of his promise at the end of class. "Let me see. How about 8 o'clock on Thursday evening? The History of Magic classroom should be large enough. I'll have to think carefully about how we're going to do this. We can't bring a real Dementor into the castle to practice on." "Still looks ill, doesn't he?" said Ron as they walked down the corridor heading to dinner. "What do you reckon's the matter with him?" There was a loud and impatient from behind them. It was Hermione, who had been sitting at the feet of a suit of armor, repacking her bag, which was so full of books it wouldn't close. "And what are you tutting us for?" said Ron irritably. "Nothing," said Hermione in a lofty voice, heaving her backpack over her shoulder. "Yes, you were," said Ron. "I said I wonder what's wrong with Lupin, and you—" "Well, isn't it obvious?" said Hermione with a look of maddening superiority. "If you don't want to tell us, don't," snapped Ron. "Fine," said Hermione haughtily, and she marched off. "She doesn't know," said Ron, staring resentfully after Hermione. "She's just trying to get us to talk to her again." At 8 o'clock on Thursday evening, Harry left Gryffindor Tower for the History of the Magic classroom. It was dark and empty when he arrived, but he lit the lamps with his wand and had waited only 5 minutes when Professor Lupin turned up, carrying a large packing case, which he heaved onto Professor Binns' desk. "What's that?" said Harry. "Another Boggart," said Lupin, stripping off his cloak. "I've been combing the castle ever since Tuesday, and very luckily I found this one lurking inside Mr. Filch's filing cabinet. It's the nearest we'll get to a real Dementor. The Boggart will turn into a Dementor when he sees you, so we'll be able to practice on him. I can store him in my office when we're not using him. There's a cupboard under my desk he'll like." "Okay," said Harry, trying to sound as though he wasn't apprehensive at all, and merely glad that Lupin had found such a good substitute for a real Dementor. So, Professor Lupin had taken out his own wand and indicated that Harry should do the same. "The spell I am going to try and teach you is highly advanced magic, Harry, well beyond ordinary wizarding level. It is called the Patronus Charm." "How does it work?" said Harry nervously. "Well, when it works correctly, it conjures up a Patronus," said Lupin, "which is a kind of anti-Dementor, a guardian that acts as a shield between you and the Dementor." Harry had a sudden vision of himself crouching behind a Hagrid-sized figure holding a large club. Professor Lupin continued. "The Patronus is a kind of positive force, a projection of the very things that the Dementor feeds upon. Hope, happiness, the desire to survive, but it cannot feel despair as real humans can, so the Dementors can't hurt it. But I must warn you, Harry, that the charm might be too advanced for you. Many qualified wizards have difficulty with it." "What does a Patronus look like?" said Harry curiously. "Each one is unique to the wizard who conjures it." "And how do you conjure it?" "With an incantation, which will work only if you are concentrating with all your might on a single very happy memory." Harry cast his mind about for a happy memory. Certainly nothing that had happened to him at the Dursleys was going to do. Finally, he settled on the moment when he had first ridden a broomstick. "Right," he said, trying to recall as exactly as possible the wonderful soaring sensation of his stomach. "The incantation is this." Lupin cleared his throat. "Expecto Patronum." "Expecto Patronum," Harry repeated under his breath. "Expecto Patronum. Concentrating hard on your happy memory?" "Oh, yeah," said Harry, quickly forcing his thoughts back to that first broom ride. "Expecto Patronum. Sorry, Expecto Patronum. Expecto Patronum." Something whooshed suddenly out of the end of his wand. It looked like a wisp of silvery gas. "Did you see that?" said Harry excitedly. "Something happened." "Very good," said Lupin, smiling. "Right then. Ready to try it on a Dementor?" "Yes," Harry said, gripping his wand very tightly, and moving into the middle of the deserted classroom. He tried to keep his mind on flying, but something else kept intruding. Any second now he might hear his mother again, but he shouldn't think that, or he would hear her again, and he didn't want to. Or did he? Lupin grasped the lid of the packing case and pulled. A Dementor rose slowly from the box, its hooded face turned toward Harry, one glistening, scabbed hand gripping its cloak. The lamps around the classroom flickered and went out. The Dementor stepped from the box and started to sweep silently toward Harry, drawing a deep, rattling breath. A wave of piercing cold broke over him. "Expecto Patronum!" Harry yelled. "Expecto Patronum! Expecto—" But the classroom and the Dementor were dissolving. Harry was falling again through the thick white fog, and his mother's voice was louder than ever. echoing inside his head. "Not Harry, please, I'll do anything. Stand aside, girl."